you go first. Definitely. Right, well, if I can welcome you to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. Hello. There's no volume. Have we got volume? Good, thank you. If I can welcome you to the regular Wednesday evening programme. Before we get going, just a few things to note. I'd like to remind you that we're one of the few places in Bangkok that stocks the Mekong Review, which is a new regional magazine, comes out quarterly, and it carries things that aren't being done by much of the other media, including cultural essays and reviews of books. And I'm very pleased to say that since we've stocked it, we've actually sold out. So we will restock, and we'll look at stocking past issues that you may like to catch up on. It's well worth supporting. Looking ahead, we have a documentary coming up on Monday, April 30th, and that's about Enron, the smartest guys in the room, and it's of course about the rise and fall of one of the world's largest energy traders and the immense scandal that surrounded that. We have coming up, hopefully next week, a programme on the Malaysian election, and this is actually very difficult to do in Bangkok because there are so few people qualified to talk about Malaysia, and they of course are now all going off to cover the election, so they won't be here. So we're seeing if we can still put together a panel and bring in some people by Skype. So I would suggest you watch the bulletin for news on that. What we do have confirmed is Roger Crutchley coming to the club to launch his book, The Road to Nakhon Nowhere, which is a memoir of his life in Thailand. As you know, he's a columnist for the Bangkok Post and writes a regular humorous column that's very popular. And in the week after that, we have a programme on sustainable business, which is based on a book that was recently brought out. This is not about anything to do with sufficiency economies. It's about sustaining a new young business in Thailand. And then looking further, a little bit forward into, I think, the first week of June, we have a night launching a book about Duterte in the Philippines, which was written by our own Jonathan Miller, who's the ITN correspondent in Bangkok. And that's rather poignant because ITN have decided to close their bureau here, so his role in Thailand will be changed. He will be staying on. Anyway, and so to this evening, The Spy Who Loved Us. Great for the FCCT to actually get the title of the book wrong. It's in fact The Spy Who Didn't Love Us. Punji Trap. And it's written by Luke Hunt, who has covered wars, international politics and economics for Agence France Presse, where he served as bureau chief in Afghanistan and later Cambodia. And he also had a roving reporting assignment from his home in Hong Kong for AFP. Luke has written for The Age in his native Melbourne, The New York Times, The Times of London, The Economist, and he still writes a weekly column in Southeast Asia for The Diplomat. His broadcasts have appeared regularly on ABC in Australia and on Voice of America. He is currently an opinion editor for UCA News and is a senior lecturer at Panasastra University in Phnom Penh, where he currently lives. And he's for the university there, he wrote a course on war, media, and international relations. And so that he wouldn't be lonely, we have accompanying him James Pringle, who's one of the great veteran journalists based in Bangkok for many years. He's been a journalist for more than 6 decades. It's hard to believe looking at him. So his age is a top secret, but he is in fact 80. And his assignments have been extremely exotic, ranging from Asia to Cuba, the Americas. He covered the wars in Southeast Asia, where he was bureau chief for Reuters in South Vietnam, and later in the Middle East for Newsweek. He was also the bureau chief for the Times of London in Beijing, where he was one of only 5 accredited Western correspondents in the country at the time. and he was replacing a colleague. It was Gray, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Yeah. Replacing a colleague who'd just spent 2 years under house arrest for his reporting activities. That's quite a daunting position to be occupied. So, Punji Trap. Luke, tell us what the book's about.
Well, the book is about Pham Xuan, and he's probably one of the most underrated characters of the Vietnam War period. And but it started a long time ago. I was doing an undergrad thesis at university in 1989, and sorry, louder. How's that? Oh, now I sound. Now I feel like a rock star. It's not comfortable, It came through. He came to my attention through other journalists when I was very young, and then I happened to meet the right people. And in '92, I went to Vietnam after meeting with Jim Pringle, other people like Leo Dobbs. There's a couple other scallywags back there that a few of you will know. And I did get to meet him, and I got to know him over many years. To kind of put An in context, when the Americans, the first American defeat in Vietnam was in 1962. Now, the Viet Cong knew the Americans were coming, and they had set up a trap, and it was an abysmal defeat for the Americans. 2 people were awarded the Liberation Exploitation Medal by the communists in Hanoi. One of them went to the battlefield commander, the other went to the Reuters correspondent, and that was Pham Xuan. An received 5 Liberation Exploit Medals. The second, the second was 1965 for his work, which basically gave the communists the head-ups about the American landings at Da Nang. At that point, he was working with Beverly Ann Deep, now Kiva, and he was her fixer. She was working for the International Herald Trib, Christian Science Monitor, and Newsweek, and she was married to Chuck Kiva, full bird colonel in the military. The third medal he got was for the coverage by Time magazine of the Tet Offensive, which, as we know now, was actually an American victory, but it was portrayed as an American defeat. And this helped turn the American public opinion against the war and had a lot to do with what would follow afterwards. He was subsequently awarded another 2 Liberation Exploit Medals. One was for his anticipation of communist victory in '76, which was wrong, and then he was given another for great services later on. But a lot of people aren't he slipped through. No one ever really fully understood who he was and what he was doing. And there was only one journalist Jim, who knew An very well, there was only one journalist who ever called him out and said, "You're a spy." And that was a New Zealand journalist by the name of Nick Turner, who was the Reuters bureau chief in 1962. And he sacked An. And then it was at that point that, I think it was 62, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was at that point An went to work for Time magazine. And right throughout, it's just been an amazing story. And there has been other books written on him. One was in French, another was the official version by Larry Berman. But what I did was to go through and basically interview all the journalists, and then I got to know An. And the biggest problem I had was that most of the information that was given to me and the stories I was told was not only off the record, it was deep background. So, and a lot of journalists are here, and I'm sure you can understand the problems with that, because you're sitting back and you've got this cracking story, and it's like, well, how do I write it? This bit's off the record, this bit's on the record, I can't say this, I can't say that. And the stories that An told me were to remain off the record until he was dead. And that was the same situation with Pham Ngoc Dinh and several other people who I interviewed along the way. And eventually I just decided, bugger it, write it the way you see it, and then wait and see what happens. And then basically, as time has passed, I decided to finally finish the book and bring it out, and here we are. But I think Jim's been terrific right throughout. I first met Jim in 1989, I think it was, and now I'm sitting here with him. And when you go through the book, I didn't mean to write Jim's biography, but there's certainly a lot about him and a lot of other journalists who did some fantastic stuff during the Vietnam War and afterwards. And I was quite chuffed that it's actually all come together at this time. Jim, do you want to say something? Help me out here.
Yeah, well, if you could put that picture again. There's a picture. Yeah, I'm on the right. And there's a French journalist, Bernard Faulder, who had come in and out of Vietnam for a long, long time. I'd just been for 6 weeks in Vietnam. I was very much a new boy. And I was very happy that Bernard Faulder would be able to show me the way around. Unfortunately, Bernard Faulder, 3 months after this picture, stood on a mine well, and he was killed. So when I heard that, I thought, it's every one man for himself here in Vietnam, and that's the way it was. Now, Luke Hunt has covered wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, but he was too young to be in Vietnam for the war there.
Hard to believe.
But I wasn't, and because of that, he's asked me to give you a taste of what was like in Vietnam around 1966 to 1971. It was 3 years I never forgot, and it was also unlike other wars I covered in other parts of the world, such as Nigeria with its starving children, Dominican Republic with the Americans shooting up the place. The viciousness of the Vietnam War has never been defeated. The Americans were out to kill people, as they admitted openly, kill, kill, kill. Body count was all. If you could kill the enemy, you were a celebrity. So I will start by giving an account of my first half hour in Vietnam, uncovering my first story there after 2 weeks settling in Saigon. I found myself in a story that I narrowly missed dying in, but 2 American soldiers did die, and I was the last to talk to them alive. In the first half hour, an empty shell came over to indicate where other shells would follow. A lieutenant officer seemed uncertain somewhat about the lone shell. Anyway, I had to return after half an hour by helicopter to a nearby base where I could give some information by phone to Reuters. And a helicopter was coming in, and 2 large soldiers were getting off the helicopter carrying the commander's folded but heavy tent. They were going to between 2 palm trees, the same as 100 other soldiers had been before them, including myself. None of us did anything to make it more fearsome. But these 2 men together carrying this heavy tent blew up. There was a tremendous. I just said to them, I was walking to get to the helicopter. I said, that other soldiers were running to the. I looked round and saw the 2 men were indeed ripped apart. I had been the last to talk to them and had barely escaped. Other soldiers had been flung into the air and onto the ground. I wasn't sure whether I was alive or not. Other soldiers were running to the side of the two men, and in the end, their bodies were put on the helicopter I was on. They were not in green rubber body bags, which had not yet arrived at this place. I sat in the chopper with the two dead soldiers at my feet. After I filed a story, it actually made just 2 paragraphs in the end. I was told to head for the north of South Vietnam. A Christmas truce was coming on, and on the plane I met Bernard Faulder, an experienced French military man who was flying north to give a lecture to senior US officers who didn't pay any attention what he had to say. And okay, thanks. I was a little worried by Bernard carrying a small French carbine, especially during a truce. It was a Christmas truce that was on. We as correspondents had agreed not to carry weapons in case of falling into the communist side. As reporters, we thought we should not carry weapons, though we wore uniforms without insignia. If we didn't wear uniforms, if we wear our ordinary clothes, we would be, the Viet Cong would think that we were soldiers, and they would attack us and shoot us. I was not invited into to the lecture, but I was told I would be able to listen to Christmas carols sung under the pouring rain. And this is what I heard: jingle bells, mortar shells, VC in the grass. You can take your Merry Christmas and shove it up your, well, you know what. Bernard Faulder was killed, as I mentioned, when he stood on a mine. It was one of these terrible mines that jumps up in front of you and explodes in your guts. Yes. And while we are on the subject of songs or poems, Luke is an Australian, as you know. I will give you another song that the bar girls sang in Saigon about the supposed meanness of the Australians, although I had always found the Aussies generous. Uk Daloi, which meant Australian then, is no longer in use in Vietnam. Anyway, this song was Uk Daloi, Australian, he cheap Charlie, he no buy me Saigon tea. All my charms he wants for me. Uk Daloi, he cheap Charlie. I went further north near where the river split the border, which had just been bombed by the Americans. I was on a truck with weeping women on the back. I had seen their houses just bombed by American planes, and they had been put on this truck to take them away. And one of the Americans, he was the man who was taking charge of the gun there, a 50-60 calibrator gun, and he said, the gunner said to the driver of the truck, with all these women in the back, having seen all their houses and their ancient their ancient monuments destroyed. One of the gunner said, they might have waited until we're out of sight. Look, they're all crying. And the driver said, what the hell does it matter? They have no feelings, they're only gooks. We talked about number 2 in the Air Force, Air Force Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky, who wore a purple flying suit, drank, gambled, and was a womanizer. What we want is more men like Hitler, Cao Kai said. I don't think this was a description would go down too well. In any case, the beautiful Madame Ngo Dinh Nhu, married to the Prime Minister Diem of Vietnam, South Vietnam, though a fervent Catholic, thought it all right if prostitutes would be allowed in Vietnam as long as they wore white tunics. But unfortunately, these uniforms looked very similar to the white uniforms nurses wore too. After 10 months, I became bureau chief, but by this time, there were 500 American soldiers were dying every week. I wondered how our 4 or 5 correspondents and our 2 local reporters could survive this. It could only be a question of time. Death was everywhere we looked in Vietnam. It was horrible, horrible. But I kept on making trips, and once on a river spotted a Viet Congs, red and blue with a yellow star waving from the treetop. I made the mistake of telling the American crew of this boat, and they said they didn't want to climb the tree for this trophy, but they pointed out an elderly man pedaling on his ancient bicycle along the embankment, and they said, "Hi, let's get that old gook cycling past there and force him to climb the tree and get hold of that flag, Viet Cong flag, as a souvenir." It was just as if they had never been advised of realities here. That could be a trap, I told the crew. I felt an idiot for telling them in the first place. It can be connected to a bomb, and or it could be a trap in itself. If you try to take it, we can all die. Was Pham Xuan An a spy? I didn't suspect him, though. I thought he was a very well-informed correspondent, and he had excellent connections. Up till the end, I really didn't think that he was a spy. He came into on the night of Tet, 1968. He talked to our local correspondent, Pham Ngoc Dinh, and he said, "You should stay indoors tonight because things are going to happen in Saigon." And I thought, well, I'm surprised because there had been fighting in the north the previous 2 nights. But I thought maybe some guerrillas would come into near the outskirts of the town. I didn't imagine they were coming right into town. And I drove at 2 o'clock in the morning, I drove my colleague out to where his girlfriend, who worked for the British Embassy, and he said, "I'll just stay here and I'll see you in the morning." And at 2 o'clock in the morning, when I came back in the car, I hadn't seen anybody on the streets at all, but there were the guerrillas were all over. and they were hitting they hit the American embassy, and they didn't get inside the embassy, but they got into they blew up the wall around the embassy, and were in that far, if not in the embassy. And at 2:40 in the morning, I got out of bed. My office was above a place where we could send information immediately. And I got out of bed, and I went downstairs. I lived above the office, and the glass. I saw bullets flashing by both ways in both directions, and there were shots coming from 25 meters away from the Time magazine office, and I'm pretty certain that this was Anne, the spy, who was shooting at the down the road towards the government headquarters. And I wondered if it was Anne, the spy, because he sometimes spent the night at the Time office, and there was another male employee there, and anyway, I got down on the. We had a man to send the copy, but they were in the very heart of the city. The Viet Cong were there, and the man who was sending the copy was holding up a light, a candle light, and I was on my hands and knees writing the first news of the attacks in the central of Saigon, but I could my hands were trembling so much that I had to hold one of them while I wrote "Flash, flash, Central Saigon under attack." And towards daylight, I risked going along to the American embassy and saw soldiers in flak jackets and helmets attacking their own embassy, because the communists were inside the embassy, they were on the outside. My worst experience in Vietnam, I was there for a year and a half, and then I left to go to Cuba, and I was asked to go back to Vietnam for another year and a half. Anyway, my worst experience of all was I was up in northern South Vietnam. There were 4 places set aside and two helicopters. I was with 3 soldiers who were also soldier journalists, and on the other helicopter were the correspondents from AP, UPI, and Agence France-Presse. The ground when I was looking down, we were in the very north of South Vietnam. There were there were so many circles from B-52 bombings that they mingled with one another. And anyway, my helicopter was the first, and I jumped 6 feet from the ground and on the skids of the chopper with the 3 soldier reporters. But suddenly, shells which were being fired from North Vietnam opened up, and I ran until a man said, "Quick, jump into this hole that I've dug." So I jumped into the foxhole on top of him, but I was sticking out. I'd picked up a helmet because we usually picked up helmets from soldiers who had been killed, and so I had a helmet on, but the shells were so close that they were hitting my helmet. The shrapnel was hitting the helmet, and I thought, any minute now I will understand whether there's a life after death or not, because I felt I couldn't survive this, because I was sticking out of the ground, and the North Vietnamese were shelling us. I thought I couldn't survive this. And after a while, as the shells continued to hit our area, the man underneath me, whom I was protecting, but he was saving my life for sharing his foxhole with him. He said, "You'll have to get out and get my wireless. It's 10 yards away." And I thought, if I have to walk and run across 10 yards, I'm going to die. It would be impossible to survive. I don't know if I mentioned that mine was the first helicopter. The second helicopter was carrying the other correspondents from AP, UPI, and Agence France-Presse. When they saw what was happening, that we were being shelled, they flew back away from this whole area. But I was on the ground now, and my helicopter had taken off without me. We were stuck. At last, the shelling. I did get out, and I got the wireless, and the man in the foxhole called for planes to hit the place in North Vietnam where the shelling was coming from. And so at last the shelling stopped, and it was only then that I heard Marines, American Marine soldiers, calling, "Mom, Mom, Mom." I said to the soldier I was with in this foxhole, I said, "What are they calling?" He said, "They're calling for the mothers. They're calling from the mothers." And who could blame them? If I would have been calling for my mother too, if I could. But of course we were in a very remote area. Nobody really could call them mothers. But I managed to get the helicopter came in, and there were 5 dead. And once again, the dead were with me in the helicopter, and we took the helicopter out to sea, and there was a helicopter boat out there, and we landed there, and all the soldiers who were on the boat came forward to look at the dead soldiers, and it looked as if it was. I couldn't understand why they were looking at the dead soldiers, but thanks. Thank you very much. And they were what they were doing was looking to see if any of their friends were there, and I saw that many times afterwards. Soldiers coming forward to looking at the dead, and that's why they were doing it. They were trying to see if any of their friends were there. And 2 weeks later, I flew back to the UK at the end of my 18-month arrangement. And one morning, my mother called up the stairs and told me that the BBC were reporting that 2 Reuters correspondents had been killed in Saigon, along with 2 other correspondents. And Reuters wanted to send me to Cuba, so I went to Cuba, and I used to see Commandante Fidel talking to 18-year-old girls from North Vietnam who were studying there. They're mostly around about 18. And I saw them taking Fidel Castro's fingers on their hands. Each girl was holding onto one of his fingers, and it was all above board. Fidel had enough Cuban ladies. Anyway, he wasn't interfering with Vietnamese girls. But and Castro was told that I had been a correspondent in Vietnam, and he was keen to talk to me because he wanted to know as much as he could. I didn't tell him any secrets. I didn't know any secrets anyway, but I did tell him about what it was like being a correspondent in Vietnam. And I got to know the Cuban ambassador to Vietnam, and his embassy was was just a sign in the forest saying Embajada de Cuba. I was a Spanish speaker, so that's why I was sent there. But then Reuters, I was a single man still, and Reuters only sent correspondents who were single, and the top correspondent in London, a fellow Scot, thanked me for what I was doing by saying, "Jim, please, we need you to go back to Vietnam again." And so I spent another 18 months in Vietnam, and this was after our correspondence. Nobody had died when I was there, but unfortunately there had been a loss of two of our correspondents dead, and but my second period in Vietnam was is another story that'll have to be for another day.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Well, it's not often you hear a live account of the Tet Offensive from somebody who actually covered it. But when you were describing the firing which you were seeing from your window, you tell this extraordinary story of fire coming from the Time Bureau towards the government headquarters, and that you wondered whether it was Pamswan and did you wonder that at the time, or is that something that you've wondered since?
No, it only came to me sometimes later, afterwards.
After the book?
It couldn't have been anyone else.
Right.
It couldn't have been. He was shooting at the palace, and at the guns at of the guards at the palace, and so it was him. It was Anne.
And Anne's,
There's no doubt.
people like Fan Knocked In certainly confirmed that Anne was in the Time building that night. There's no doubt about that, because Pham Suan came out and told Din, this is going to happen, like, it's about now.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
he had come into the office, and he said to Den, and then he didn't talk to me because he was working for Time magazine, and I was Reuters. He had been working for Reuters, but he was fired by because one of the bureau chief before me thought that he was a communist. I basically didn't believe he was. I thought he was just a very good correspondent, but even if he was a very useful man to have. So I was indignant as a bureau chief there that he had been fired like that. But because in Vietnam, Anne was a good man. He was a spy, but he was a good man, because when correspondents had been captured, he disappeared, and he was going to tell the people who are holding these correspondents that they shouldn't be harmed, that they were unarmed people, and they were just reporting on the war, and they were doing it honestly. So
he had his uses, you know.
Yes, he was. He wasn't a wicked man by any means.
Peter.
Yeah, Luke.
Hey, Pete.
In your research, did you find that there were other spies within the?
Not at this level, no. Not at this level, no. There were. There may have been others, and a lot of people in this room have worked as journalists in difficult places, and there's been a lot of local hires, fixers. But you have to remember that Arne studied in America. He fought with the communists in World War II. He was there when they had the kind of revolution Ho Chi Minh inspired in 1945. By the time he got to America, and by the time he came back, he was a highly articulate man. He was working at a level that no one else was. I mean, I'm sure that there may well have been others, but,
there were
but
others.
Hanoi has not rewarded anybody else who worked in the Western media or as a journalist the way they have Pham Suan. I don't know of any other. I know there are a couple of other names. Yes, they escape me at the moment. But I mean, Arne got five liberation exploitation medals and was promoted to the rank of brigadier general. And I don't know of any other Vietnamese journalists working in South Vietnam at the time who got that.
You know, I've bought your book, but I haven't read it, obviously. How did they place him? You know, how did they
With great difficulty.
How did they position him? And you're saying there were no others, so I guess there wasn't sort of a system of placing spies.
No, well, it was Viet Cong for starters, and most people who know Vietnam understand the differences between the NVA, the North, the South, and the Viet Cong, and what was going out at Cu Chi, War Zone D up near the Parrot Beak in Cambodia. And he was, before he went to America, he was pulled aside by 3 senior Viet Cong communists, and they told him, we want you to go to America and we would like you to do a PhD. Stay there as long as you can and then come back, because they knew they saw themselves as being in for a long fight. He came back early only because his father had died and that he had family commitments. So he went and he studied in Orange Coast, California, and then he did a trip and an internship in New York with studying the UN Press Corps. And he had an option to study at Columbia University, but he didn't take it up.
Hi.
Hi.
Am I supposed to say my name? George Lerner, not a journalist. I've read Larry Berman's book, and I wondered, in your book, one, what do you see as the parallels between Pam and Larry Sorge, or journalists who were actually spies in previous wars? And also, were you able to look at the archives in North Vietnam?
Yeah, Larry did everyone a favour, because I happened across this story in like 1989, and I went up to Vietnam and had all the right introductions, and people like Jim were terrific. But for people who knew what Vietnam was like back then, it was pretty difficult, and they weren't forthcoming. I did get to meet people like Tran Van Tra, General, and I knew Tran Bac Dung, who a lot of people here wouldn't know, but he was a highly ranked political commissar, and the political commissars often outranked the generals. And we got Larry's book, A Perfect Spy. He managed to get a hold of all the official archives, and he was able to articulate, like when you're interviewing these guys, it's like, okay, what's the name of the medal? And you're getting everything, all the language is bastardised, the way you're interviewing people, how you find, it's all over the place. But Larry managed to he got the official archive, and he actually managed to put a lot of the basic framework in place. And so, but what I've done with this book was to go out and interview all the journalists who worked with Arn, and people like Pham Ngoc Dinh, who Arn hired. Arn got Pham Ngoc Dinh a job with Reuters in 1960, and they became best friends. And then in 1985, when Dinh was arrested, when Jim was talking about the 4 journalists who were killed at Cho Long during the mini-tet in 1968, Dinh was the one who went out there and put his hand on their hearts to make sure they were dead. In particular, one, Bruce Piggott, who was very close to Dinh. And it was because of that the Australian government, his services to Australian journalists who died in the field, gave him an exit visa. But because they gave him an exit visa, Hanoi thought he was a spy. In fact, there were people running around saying Dinh was a spy when he was not, and he was in all sorts of trouble. And then it was Pham Suan who actually came along and went guarantor for him, which enabled him to get an exit visa and go to Australia. And then I met him 5 years later when he was working for Australian Associated Press. So what I'm saying is that Larry did a terrific job in terms of the official framework and the story. My book's totally different to that. If that helps, if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. But the other part of the question was, what are the parallels between Pam and like spies like Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo back in the 1930s? I mean, when you have a journalist who's actually one of the most important spies in the country, it seems very strange because Pam never actually had any real training before he left Vietnam to go to America. One would assume the KGB spies, for example, they went through 1 or 2 or 3 years of training, like Richard Sorge did. But it seemed Pam didn't have it. How did he go through that? I mean, how did he... He passed off very well, and it seems kind of strange.
To go down that track, you need to look at Ho Chi Minh and how he said... look at Osama bin Laden and how to keep it modern, how Osama bin Laden set up the cell structures for terrorist networks. Ho Chi Minh was doing that based on what he had learnt in the Soviet Union from the early 1930s out of Hong Kong right across Indochina. And it was all very kind of... the parallels there are enormous. You have 2 or 3 people sitting as sleeper cells working in various places, and then when things erupt, they are there to be taken advantage of. And I think that happens right across that whole communist espionage network.
Thanks.
Michael Mackey.
Hey, Mike.
Hi, Luke. Just a question. On what well, it's two in fact. What motivated him? Does this? I'm not sure whether he was deliberately planted by Hanoi in a kind of centralist mode, or whether he was somebody who just realised the situation and went over. Did he, and also was he an individual, which I think refers to the Russian spy was just in the previous question, but also how much intelligence did he actually get into Hanoi, and how much impact did it actually have?
Well, in answer to your second question, shitloads. In answer to your first question, Arn started with what they call the propaganda platoons in the 1940s, where the communists, like through the cell structure, had mobilised groups of people, young people. They had youth movements. There was a National Liberation Women's Front. There was a National Liberation Farmers Front. In fact, Arn brought out, when I was at his house many times, and he brought out these maps which had been hand-drawn in ink. They were miles wide. And it started at the top, and it went boom, 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 boom. And Arn was in the NYP, National Youth Platoon. And they used to do fundraisers, and they'd raise money, and they'd have meet girls, and they'd do all that kind of stuff. And he kind of grew into one of them. He was Canto, I think. I'd have to go back and check. But he was Canto, Mito, that kind of region between the Mekong Delta. And then what happened was in 1945, they decided to arm the propaganda platoons and send them out into the jungles, mainly to fight. They feared the Vichy French were going to make a comeback as the Japanese were withdrawing in 45. So they armed the propaganda platoon, and they armed them rather badly. You know, there was, I think Arn was telling me it was like 3 guns for a sampan, crossbows, spears. They used to get the cartridges back and rebuild the bullets, that kind of stuff. And that's where he started. And then after that he was quite crook for 5 years. He had tuberculosis, a couple other things. But it was when he got a job with, really started with Tran Kim Tuem, who headed up the CIA operations, and he started as a junior clerk in Customs House, and that's when he came under their eye, and he was already known and verified in certain quarters. And when he applied for the scholarship to America, that's when they really started paying attention to who he was and where he was going. And that would have been mid-1950s.
Luke, I appreciate that shitloads is a highly technical term.
Right.
But could you quantify it a bit further and give examples of where the technical term actually had an impact?
The correct term is research and systems. And so what he would do for a standard kind of report it'd be like, okay, let's launch the Tet Offensive in 1965. If we launch the Tet Offensive, we will have 5 possible scenarios. Each scenario will create another scenario. You'll have 5 possible scenarios. That's 25 scenarios. And he'd work it down like that. That's when he would do his actual reports. When he was up our bark, he was taking photographs. He would develop the film in the toilet, and then he'd give it to a woman called Major Nam, sometimes known as B2. And that information was then sent to, normally through Cu Chi, up into War Zone D. And then it was sent either through friendly embassies, friendly diplomatic missions, but it would wind up in Hanoi. And so, I mean, in terms of the major offences, like Up Bark, which was a dreadful American defeat, you know, it was 3 years before the Americans had landed at Da Nang. And the battlefield commander for the Viet Cong and An both got a Liberation Exploit Medal. The Da Nang certainly, and then the big one was really 68, the Time, when he was working for Time magazine. And what he was asked to do was to promote the idea that the Americans had lost the Tet Offensive, when in fact they had not. And the American public believed that. And that turned public opinion against the war. And that was absolutely extraordinary. And if you want to run a war, I'm trying very hard not to take sides in this, but if you want to run a war, you really want to think about how you're going to be doing that, because that's pretty much what happened.
Michael Kelly and I work
Mr.
with...
Father Nick, how are you, mate?
Good, mate. I work with Luke. Luke, that's a good note to start on. How dumb were the Yanks? Really? No, I've got a bit of background. If you look at the way in which the espionage world was developed through the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, and particularly if you take, I mean, I met the guy 30 years ago. I met the guy who was the translator for Graham Greene.
Right.
When
Who
he
knew?
was-
Who? Graham Greene
He
used
picked
to
it-
file his
he-
copy through Farm Suan.
Yeah, but he picked the whole thing that was going on
Yep, that's right.
in the mid-50s. Now, the question you've got to ask is, were the Yanks on no-dose pills? What were they doing? Were they,
No, to be honest,
how did they miss what was going on?
I just think they were dreadfully naive. I don't think they were stupid at all.
Dreadfully naive or completely ignorant.
No, look, I
When
think
someone presents, I mean, these are the guys that have just escaped from dealing with the Soviets and dealing with the Nazis, and then they turn up in Vietnam and they think that maybe we take McNamara at his word that no one in the American administration even knew where Vietnam was.
that's true. He did, and he
Yeah.
was right.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by dreadfully
And
naive.
so you have this guy with complete licence to be a double agent, and the CIA, which was well and truly on the job in Vietnam
Yes,
in
they
the
were.
early to mid-50s, and they just didn't pick it, and they didn't pick it for 20 years. What sense can you make of whether the espionage services, the security services, are they just as thick as three planks? Are they just bricks that don't get it? Or what was going on?
No, I don't think they're stupid at all. In fact, they're very clever. I do think that the whole war epitomises just how naive people were when they went in. I mean, the Americans were invited in through the Geneva Accords and the French pulling out. And I will add, there were quite a few, and when I say naive, I mean, a lot of people like to get onto the Americans about what they did wrong. And the Americans are bad. Oh, the Americans are dreadful. Oh, the Americans shouldn't have been there. Well, someone had to be there, and it wasn't going to be the Australians or the Brits or the Russians. Someone had to be there, and the only country capable of doing it was America. Now, the Vietnamese told three great lies, and the Americans believed them. One, that it was a war of national liberation, which it was not. The Viets had never got more south than Da Nang. They were still at war with the Chams in 1832. In terms of South Vietnam, if you all know Independence Palace, I'm sure some of you will know that before it was named Independence Palace, it was called Norodom Palace, and that the Khmers have enormous claims over South Vietnam. It was never a national war of liberation. The second great lie they told was, one of the great ones was Tet. And another great lie told by them was that no one ever gave them permission to invade South Vietnam. They did. And what they did was, when Watergate was happening, and Nixon really scared the bejesus out of them. And when they realised that Nixon was heading out, that's when they started testing the waters to see what they could get away with, and they did. I think when I say naive, they believed the Vietnamese. They believed the North Vietnamese, and they told a lot of lies. And this is what happens in wars. And I think that's why I say I think the Americans were more dreadfully naive than they were stupid. I don't think they were stupid at all. In fact, I think a lot of the things they did were very brave and well-intentioned. But, it was a dreadful war.
If you disregard the CIA and what it knew and didn't know in the intelligence units, how on earth could Time magazine not have known that a story had been wrongly reported out of Saigon, and that somebody had been shooting out of the window overnight? I mean, these things could not be missed. There was a push after the Tet Offensive, there was
big powwow held by all the time bureau chiefs went to Saigon, and Nguyen Ngoc Phuc, who was a very posh-spoken English Vietnamese journalist, was in on the meeting. Pham Xuan was in on the meeting. There were several of them, and time management, so I was told by several people who were at that meeting, believed it was unwinnable. They believed the war was unwinnable after they had witnessed what had happened at Tet. And at that point, they had decided from a corporate policy position that it was unwinnable. And then I think what happens in media organisations when executives decide that, they start massaging the copy. They start believing what comes in and disbelieving over here. I've seen it myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people in this room have as well, and I think that's really what happened. And in those days too, I mean, it was a long way away. I mean, things were run by teletext, and there was the odd phone call, but people were very much left to their own devices.
So, I mean, when the US military says that the media lost the Vietnam War, in a sense, this kind of story corroborates it.
Well, I mean, a lot of people who covered the war like to boast about how they could do whatever they want. And I was in Iraq, and I was getting on helicopters and flying anywhere I wanted as well. But Vietnam, all the journalists, anyone who knows a journalist who covered the Vietnam War, they're all going to tell you what a great time they had and they could do whatever they wanted, and they did. So if the American military wants to blame the media for losing their war, I think they need to have a look at what they allowed the media to do.
Okay. Question?
Hello, everyone. My name is Hoi Trinh. I'm Vietnamese, and I'm actually working here helping Vietnamese refugees. My question is to both of you, and it's a bit of a side question. I hope it's not too irrelevant. Given your recent book on Pham Xuan, and given your account, Jim, regarding your time in Vietnam and the stories you just told us, it's fascinating, right? And it seems like Vietnam, its people, have occupied a pretty special place in your heart and your mind. But all of that happened, before the Vietnam War ended. And that was 43 years ago. Vietnam is still a nation today. There are loads of stories that, to me, is worth telling. Whether it's about the infighting within the Communist Party of Vietnam, or corruption stories, or the refugees still fleeing the communist state of Vietnam. But it seems that it hardly warrants any attention from anyone. So my question to you is, do you think my observation is correct, that there seems to be such a fascination about Vietnam, but it's all happened a long time ago? And then there's not really a lot of stories coming out of Vietnam now. Is that true? And if it's true, why? Thank you.
I think that the Vietnamese have handled things pretty well. And I think that I think this is why you have to buy this book, because I don't agree with quite a lot in it, but I think everybody has to read it. It's very important. It's a very important book, and
I agree with you, and I think it's changing.
yeah.
And if you look in, say, 20 years ago, when Frank Parmos, who incidentally was, there were five, when Jim was referring to the 4 journalists that were killed at Mini Tet, there were 5, one escaped, and that was Frank Parmos. And Frank Parmos translated Sorrows of War, which was from a North Vietnamese perspective. I do know that there are probably a dozen books in the works by former, there's a couple of Australian writers, Western English-speaking writers who are in Hanoi at the moment working with North Vietnamese soldiers and trying to get their stories told. I think one of the biggest problems has been the Vietnamese government's attitude to interpretations of their history by outsiders. They've been very strict and had very definite laws about what they think and how it should be told. That has changed over the last 10 or 15 years. It really has. And I think we're going to see a lot more, and I'd like to see a lot more books coming out about Vietnam. I was chatting with Larry Berman, and he's like, "Oh, you finally finished your book," and it's like, "Oh, that sort of stuff." And there's one or two others, and he was kind of a bit surprised when I said to him, "I think there could be another 100 books on Farm Suan," and I think there should be. There's lots of. If you look at great spies like, say, Mata Hari or the Russian spy in Japan, there's tons and tons of these books, and I'd like to see a lot more of that coming out of Vietnam, and I think it will. So I think the attitudes in Hanoi are changing a lot, and I agree with all of your sentiments, actually.
If I could just add a few things, I think you'll find actually that there are an awful lot of business stories coming out of Vietnam these days, so the number of just commercial related reporting, the amount of it has gone up significantly. Vietnam is one of the most miserable places for journalists to operate. Foreigners who are accredited there become paranoid very quickly because they're so spied upon. It's very Cold War-ish. And Vietnamese journalists live under a very bad situation, including bloggers who are the effective opposition. So we've seen bloggers sent to jail now for 14 years for discussing routine issues relating to the environment. And the other thing is that it might interest you to know that the FCCT has had problems in the last 4 years since the coup with the military junta, getting in the way of various press conferences. So I think we've had about 4 or 5 incidents where we've had to cancel programs, but most of them have related to Vietnam, and they have come out of the Vietnamese embassy protesting to the foreign ministry here, who then get onto the Lumpini police station and have blocked press conferences in a free country neighbouring, ostensibly free. So I think that's quite instructive about the attitude that the Vietnamese authorities have towards the media. It's hostile, it's unpleasant, and it's not an easy country to report in. Sorry, Craig.
Craig Skeen, a friend of Luke and also a journalist. Firstly, Luke, congratulations on your book. It's a labour of love and it's well worth reading. And also, Jim, your stories from that period were very interesting. Luke, my question is this. Do you think the contribution of Arn to the cause of the communists and the North was such that it actually influenced the outcome of that conflict? Was it so great that it could have been different? The outcome could have been different without him?
Look, if Arn had not existed and Upbak may not have been a defeat for the Americans. That could very definitely influence the outcome over the following years. But even you can go back further. I mean, there were the stay-behinds when the North Vietnamese had left. At 54, when the people in the south moved north and the Catholics, particularly in the north, moved south, the communists shifted people down south because they knew there was going to be another war. There was a chap called Lee Duan, the street outside Independence Palace bears his name. In 54, Ho Chi Minh had already decided that, yeah, he still liked South Vietnam, but he wasn't really up for a fight. It was Lee Duan who was running guerrilla activities in the south deliberately to try and prod Hanoi into pushing them back into a fight. And this goes back to kind of the naivety which Mick Kelly was talking about before. The North Vietnamese never accepted the Geneva Accords. They never kept their word at all about what was North Vietnam and what was South Vietnam. I mean, even Wilfred Burchett, the famous Australian communist journalist, expected it to be divided between North and South Vietnam. But Hanoi, it was never on. And they never said that. So in terms of Arn's contribution, it's a cerebral argument, but had he not existed, could the outcome have been different? Possibly, maybe. However, that would be to assume that the North Vietnamese would accept South Vietnam as a sovereign country, and it was a sovereign country, and the North Vietnamese never did. So if An wasn't there, there'd probably be someone else.
I think that what the United States did to Vietnam was horrific, and I think that basically the best side, the better side, won. The Americans, the way that they destroyed the whole country and killed so many people. Kill, kill, kill. That's what you heard every day. It was just a horrifying thing. The Americans deserve everything that happened to them in the end.
Question?
Kim, I believe.
Kim Atkinson. Kim Atkinson, freelancer. You mentioned that Nick Turner believed that An was a spy and and fired him in 1962.
He sacked him, yeah.
Sacked him, yeah.
Yeah.
But then why didn't the word get out, and why did Time hire him, and why didn't the Americans expose him? If
Nick Turner told Time, as far as I know.
I see.
He was saying, Nick Turner was saying, I don't like him, he's a spy. Right. But no one was believing him. And and actually, God, I remember, I think it was before Tet, Nick Turner was evacuated for appendicitis. And it was Van Ngoc Dinh who took him to the airport, and they were talking about what was going on. And Nick Turner, that would have been, 68, so 6 years. Nick Turner was saying, I don't trust him, I don't like him, he's a spy.
But I would have thought that the American government would have picked up on that too and done something, at least.
He went to their school. He studied in America. He was accepted in Columbia.
So it's naivete that won the day for An.
Oh, that's where it goes to. I think there's a lot of, naivete. Yeah.
Following on from that question, the fact that he operated and was not exposed, apart from Turner, doesn't say very much about the foreign media operating at that time, that they didn't smell this rat. What I was wondering is that you are somebody whose career is in Indochina and other war zones, but it's post-Vietnam War. Why do you suppose no foreign correspondent or writer from that period has latched onto this story and said, this is something that should be written about? Because, usually the Vietnam press corps is glorified, and we have countless Pulitzers coming out of all windows. It's a different picture that we're normally fed.
I think there's a couple of things. One is the high turnover of journalists. We all know there's a lot of people who did 3 months in Vietnam and it became the thing of their career. Bernard Fall, on the left up there, was a tremendous journalist, and the stuff he wrote going back the 50s was just, and historian Peter Dunn was another. Then there were the likes of the Three Musketeers, Robert Chaplin, Dennis Warner and Don Wise. And they were tremendous, but they were all often off doing their own thing. And Dennis Warner didn't particularly like An at all. Rob Chaplin was pretty much out of the picture by the late 60s. Don Wise was being Don Wise and debonair. But then came the next crew of journalists, and there were hundreds of them that went through between 66 and 1970, which when you're looking at the whole Vietnamese epoch, it's absolutely nothing. They'd be coming in, and some of them would do a 6-month turn and say, oh, look, I was in Vietnam. Okay, well and good. But you're not going to pick that much up in 6 months when you've got this entire history that goes back before World War II kind of coming at you. They saw them coming. It's kind of like, I'm not putting anyone down. I'm not trying to have a go at anyone, but I just think there was an enormous high turnover of journalists between, say, 66 and 1970, when a lot of the damage was done. But these guys were green, and they're coming in from the outside. And compared with the sort of the machinery that had been set up by the communists and going back decades. It was quite extraordinary, and I think they, like the Americans, were incredibly naive.
Luke, just going to your comments about the naivety of the Americans and
the Australians, and the
and the
Thais,
rest,
and the
and
South
the rest,
Koreans,
yeah.
and the Filipinos,
Mate,
and the New
grew up,
Zealanders.
I
And
grew
the
up
Thais.
listening to Liberal Prime Ministers just being echo chambers for the American line. But what do you make of this comment? That given how naive the appreciation was of what was going on in Vietnam, an Australian ambassador to Vietnam 25, 30 years ago told me some years ago that he met the fellow who was the head of, maybe he was under Le Duan or someone, but
Right.
he was the head of the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, who then subsequently became head of the Vietnamese army in the south. And he said to him, was there any time during the war that you thought you were really going to lose? He said, of course. And what gave you confidence? When they killed No Dinh Diem. That
Yeah.
he was actually a nationalist who was the match for Ho Chi Minh. Any comment?
Yeah, looking back 40 years ago, yeah, look, Diem was, well, I was going to start talking about priestly things, and the brother Catholics, and Kennedy, and McNamara, and the whole mix there. I'm not. When you say they thought they were did they think they were going to lose? You were referring to the North. I thought, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they thought that. And in regards to Diem, the Americans wanted to prop him up. Diem won an election and he declared 98% of the people backed him. And the Americans were furious because it wasn't. It was like 70-75, but he couldn't handle the idea that it was only 70-75. So he was bullshitting from the start. No, he didn't, but they had Canisian approval. They knew it was going. The Kennedy brothers knew the assassination was going ahead, and they didn't help. They stood back and they did nothing. The biggest problem at that point, the short answer is yes. The bigger answer is that you had about 8 or 9 generals, including Khan, Nguyen Khan, Big Min, who would eventually hand over do the final surrender, and these guys were all jockeying for position. Diem had, particularly through Madame Nu, which Jim was referring to, they had really upset a lot of people, and it wasn't going their way. And then there were the self-immolations. There was also lots and lots of things were going on which were whittling back at his popularity. And by the time he was assassinated, I just don't think he was as popular as he was, and I suspect the communists were probably reading too much into it. I think what really happened was that the generals no longer... Diem had managed to unify the country to a much greater extent than he was ever given credit. And then it kind of all got blown out the window, and you had all these conspiring generals around him. And I think that's what really undid South Vietnam's future, was that lack of unity, particularly in the military. I think that had a lot to do with it, and more so. But I can see where he's coming from. It's not an unfair comment.
Luke, thanks. Just one quick question. With Arne going on this study trip to America, was there ever any evidence that he was noted by the American security services? Was there ever any attempt?
They organised his visa.
But did they ever attempt to turn him into an asset?
He worked for Edward Lansdale.
He worked for who?
Edward Lansdale. He was in that department. He knew all those people. And they were the ones who offered to help him to get him on the Columbia Scholarship and that, but he went his own way. He could have gone full Edward Lansdale funded Columbia University. The problem was the Vietnamese government wouldn't give him an exit visa. And there was a lot of toing and froing, and in the end he went self-funded. But he had a lot of help, particularly from a chap called Dr. Basil Peterson, who organised Orange Coast College, Costa Mesa, California, for him, which is where he kicked it off.
Right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up in a minute. I'd just like to ask you about the publishing route that you've taken.
Sure. Yep.
You know, what were the mechanics of, congratulations on
Thank you.
producing the book, but what did you go through? Did you basically fund this yourself?
No, absolutely not. No, my university, I wrote a course, War Media and International Relations, and I'm sure everyone here is aware that things are a bit, things are a little different in Cambodia at the moment. And I was told on Monday that after 3 months of waiting and 6 months of paperwork that my press pass has finally been approved. And I'd been working on this for a long time, and then when I finally finished it, my boss said, let's publish it through the university as part of the course, and so the university is funding it.
And will you be seeking an international publisher to take it further?
My distributor is Talisman in Singapore.
Right.
We've got the university has a deal with Talisman in Singapore, which is Ian Pringle, and I haven't got a distributor in Australia or the US, but it is being distributed in Scandinavia, and it's on sale in Asia Books, and it's on sale in Singapore. Talisman have the distribution rights for UK and Asia, and it's Waterston's. There's a couple of big,
Waterston's
they're doing it out of London.
Oh, that's big,
yeah, they're already through it.
So anyway, congratulations. The book is on sale in the club tonight, and if you buy it, you have the added benefit of the author's signature.
Absolutely, and if you're really clever, get Jim Pringle to sign it as well.
Collector's club. So anyway, Jim, lovely to have you. Objective as ever, but after 6 decades, great stuff. And
Thank you.
Luke, thank you for coming all the way from Phnom Penh.
Thanks, Dominic. Cheers. Thank you.